What would you do if the man you trusted to protect your future stood up in a crowded restaurant and slapped you while you were carrying his child? Amara Whitmore had learned to smile through discomfort. As the wife of Preston Whitmore, one of the city's most celebrated real estate moguls, she knew that being Mrs. Whitmore wasn't just a title, it was a performance. From charity galas to art auctions, she had mastered the art of grace under pressure. But nothing could have prepared her for the night. Everything unraveled in front of hundreds of high society eyes. That evening had started like so many others. Preston had called to say he'd be working late. Again. Amara was nearly 8 months pregnant, and while her body ached and her heart grew heavier each day, she told herself not to worry. After all, he had been under pressure. Business was slow. His name was starting to fall out of favor in the press. Still, something didn't feel right. Then came the message. A grainy photo. A text from an acquaintance. "You need to see this." The picture showed Preston at La Belle Toll, the most exclusive restaurant in the city, arm in arm, with a woman Amara didn't recognize but instantly understood. The curves, the smile, the ease with which she leaned into Preston, this was no business dinner. Amara's heart pounded as she hailed a car, gripping her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her belly was heavy, her mind spinning. She told herself she was being irrational. Maybe it was a misunderstanding. But it wasn't. When she entered the restaurant, heads turned, not because they recognized her, but because a pregnant woman walking into a velvet-draped room filled with wine glasses and whispered gossip was out of place. She saw him, Preston, laughing. His hand resting lightly on the back of the woman beside him, Lucia Moretti, the city's newest lounge singer, imported from Rome, with a voice like smoke and a past she never spoke of. Amara's presence sucked the air out of the room. Lucia froze. Preston turned, and in that moment, everything slowed. He didn't stand. He didn't smile. He scowled. "What are you doing here?" he growled. Tears stung Amara's eyes. "So this is where you've been?" Lucia tried to slip out of sight, but it was too late. Diners were already filming. Some looked away. Others looked on with morbid fascination. Preston rose slowly. "You're making a scene." And then it happened. The slap. It cracked through the room like a gunshot. No one moved. Amara stumbled, her hand flying to her cheek. She was 8 months pregnant, and her husband, the man who once kissed her forehead in the middle of the night and whispered dreams of their future, had struck her. In public. Gasps filled the room, phones recorded from every angle. Waitstaff moved in. Someone shouted, "Call the police!" But Preston didn't run. He stood tall, jaw clenched, as if daring anyone to challenge him. Lucia tugged at his sleeve, eyes wide. "We have to go." Amara didn't cry. Not then. She simply turned and walked out, her hand on her stomach, her soul trembling. Within hours, the video had gone viral. "Millionaire slaps pregnant wife in restaurant," the headline screamed. Hashtags flooded social media. #justice for Amara, #stop domestic abuse, #no more. Silence. Overnight, the facade Preston had spent a lifetime curating began to crack. Board members at Whitmore Development grew silent. News vans circled the mansion gates like vultures. Lawyers called. PR firms scrambled. But Amara, she went home with a bruise on her cheek and a decision in her heart. She would not stay silent. Not for her child. Not for herself. Not this time. By dawn, Preston Whitmore's name had become poison. The slap wasn't just a moment, it was a movement. News anchors repeated the footage on a loop, each outlet dissecting every frame like a courtroom exhibit. There was no music, no filter, just the raw sound of flesh striking skin and a pregnant woman's stunned silence. It was the kind of clip that didn't just go viral, it went seismic. Real estate mogul Preston Whitmore caught on camera hitting his pregnant wife at LaBelle Toll, one network declared. Another ran with, Amara Whitmore breaks the silence, victim of power, not partner in it. Social media ignited like a match to gasoline. Strangers shared their outrage. Survivors shared their stories. Advocates demanded accountability. No one was neutral. That morning, Amara sat in her friend Renee Carter's guest room, the curtains drawn. Her cheeks still bore the redness of last night's betrayal. But it was the ache beneath her ribs that lingered, the ache of humiliation, of shock, of disbelief that something so private had become so public. Renee poured her tea with hands that trembled with anger. He hit you. In public. While you're carrying his child. I don't care how rich he is, he's going down. Amara didn't speak. She watched the steam rise from her cup, imagining it was everything she had bottled up for years finally drifting away. What if I make it worse? Renee sat beside her. Worse for who? For him. A beat passed. I don't know where to begin, Amara whispered. And then came the knock. Not paparazzi. Not Preston. It was Jasmine Lee. She was calm, composed, and dressed in soft blue, nothing intimidating, everything firm. A legal advocate who'd handled too many cases like this and knew exactly how they started, how they unraveled, and how they could end with courage, if guided well. I'm not here to pressure you, Jasmine said gently, but what happened to you last night was a crime. And you don't have to go through it alone. Amara looked at her, her voice barely audible. Even if he's Preston Whitmore? Especially because he is, Jasmine replied. They talked for over an hour. Jasmine explained legal rights, restraining orders, protective custody if needed, and even temporary housing, though Amara declined. She had Renee, and for the first time she realized how powerful a friend could be. Outside, news vans circled like hawks. Reporters whispered into microphones from across the street, hungry for a glimpse. Headlines now painted Amara as a modern-day heroine. They called her the silent strength, the woman who stood tall, the voice for so many. But inside that guest room, Amara wasn't feeling strong. She was feeling scared. For her baby, for her privacy, for what would happen next. Later that day, Preston tried to reach her. First a voicemail, then a text. I made a mistake. We need to talk. She didn't reply. Then came the flowers, white roses, a handwritten note. For the sake of our child, let's resolve this quietly. Renee scoffed when she saw them. Quietly. Of course, he's not worried about you. He's worried about headlines. Amara didn't keep the card. She handed it to Jasmine. Keep everything, she said. I don't want to forget what he's capable of when no one's watching, and especially when they are. That night, Amara turned off the television. She muted every alert on her phone. She sat by the window, one hand resting on her belly, and whispered to the life inside her. I won't let him define your story. I won't let fear win. Outside, the world was loud. Inside, Amara began to reclaim her voice. Preston Whitmore had built his empire on image. Every gleaming skyscraper he developed, every luxury event he sponsored, every photo op with smiling children, none of it was accidental. It was curated, controlled, perfectly lit for public consumption. But now, there was no lighting soft enough to blur what had happened. The video of him slapping his pregnant wife, Amara played on every major network. Late-night comedians cracked jokes. Activists called for arrest. How justice. For Amara, trended for days, and his public relations team, they were imploding. Victor Malone, his longtime attorney, stormed into his office. You hit a pregnant woman? On camera. Preston, this isn't something we can spin with a charity donation. Preston paced the marble floor of his penthouse suite, jaw clenched. She ambushed me, he snapped. She walked into that restaurant like she was the victim. She is, Victor said flatly. The entire world sees that. Preston stopped, eyes narrowing. We're not issuing a statement. Victor looked at him like he'd lost his mind. You don't have a choice anymore. You need to appear remorseful. Apologize publicly. Settle privately. And above all, keep your mouth shut until we can assess the legal damage. But Preston was too proud. He hadn't built Whitmore Developments from nothing by apologizing every time someone got offended. He believed the storm would pass. It always had before. His money, his charm, his power. They had insulated him from consequence for years. This time felt different. Within days, corporate partners began backing away. Ads were pulled. Shareholders grew silent. The board scheduled an emergency session without him. The walls were closing in, but Preston still refused to reach out to Amara directly. To him, contrition was weakness. He told himself she had overreacted. She had embarrassed him in public. She had made the choice to confront him, but deep down, he felt it. Fear. Meanwhile, across town, Amara sat with Jasmine Lee, the advocate who had become her legal anchor. The air between them was heavy with decision. The DA is reviewing the footage, Jasmine said gently. They may file charges without your testimony. But if you cooperate, it strengthens the case. Amara stared at the screen of her phone, which buzzed with messages from strangers. Some were supportive, some invasive. All of them reminded her that privacy, once lost, is hard to reclaim. Do I want to be the face of this? She murmured. Do I want my child growing up with Google results? Jasmine didn't push. That's your choice, but I'll be with you either way. That evening, Amara received a visit from someone she hadn't expected, a woman named Nia Thompson, founder of a local nonprofit called Women First. Nia had spent decades fighting for women like Amara women, who were well-dressed, well-spoken, and still victims of abuse. She didn't offer pity. She offered power. You don't owe the public your story, Nia said, but if you decide to speak, speak for you. Not for the headlines, not for justice on social media. Speak because your voice is your own again. Amara nodded slowly. I'll think about it. And she did. She sat in the guest bedroom that night, a journal open on her lap, pen tapping at the edge of the page. The baby kicked, soft and rhythmic, like a heartbeat inside her. She had once imagined decorating the nursery with Preston by her side. Now she wondered if her child would ever know their father without pain in the memory. She began to write. Not a statement, not a press release, but a vow. To my child, I will never stay silent to protect someone else's image. I will never let power excuse violence. I will teach you that dignity matters more than legacy. At Whitmore Developments, the mood had shifted from anxious to apocalyptic. Employees whispered in break rooms, investors sent cold emails, and the board chairman finally delivered what Preston never thought he'd hear. We're asking you to step down, Preston. Effective immediately. He didn't yell, he didn't argue, he simply walked out of the building he had named after himself. But even then, he believed he'd get it back, because men like Preston Whitmore always did. Until they didn't. It was a rainy Thursday morning when Amara Whitmore finally stepped in front of a camera. She wore no designer labels, no dramatic makeup, just a navy maternity dress, pearl earrings, and a steady gaze that defied the chaos swirling around her. The room was quiet. Journalists from major networks sat in folding chairs, microphones on. No flash photography. That had been Amara's only request. Jasmine Lee stood just behind her, calm but watchful. On the other side of the podium, Renee Carter and Nia Thompson gave silent nods of encouragement. Amara took a breath. My name is Amara Whitmore, she began, her voice soft but unwavering. Many of you know me as the woman in that video, but I'm also a mother, an art curator, a daughter, a person who believed in love and forgiveness, maybe for too long. The room held its breath. I didn't plan to speak publicly. I didn't want to be a headline, but silence can become a prison. And I won't raise my child inside one. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. What happened to me was not a private matter. It was a public crime. And what happens next is bigger than just Preston and me. It's about who we protect, who we believe, and what we tolerate behind closed doors. There was no grand flourish, no dramatic walk-off. She simply stepped back, nodded, and left the room as quietly as she had entered. But the world erupted. Within hours, her full statement aired on every major outlet. Clips went viral. Opinion pieces flooded in. And for the first time, the narrative shifted from shocking scandal to reckoning. Support poured in from domestic violence survivors, celebrities, and politicians, but not everyone was on her side. She should have kept it private, one commentator said. She's destroying a man's legacy, another opined. A viral tweet asked, was it really abuse or just a bad moment caught on tape? Amara saw it all and chose not to respond. Let the noise be noise. She had said her truth. That same afternoon, Preston received an official notice. He was being summoned for questioning by the district attorney's office. The charge? Felony assault of a pregnant spouse. For the first time in days, he panicked. Not because he feared jail, he had lawyers. Not because he feared scandal, he'd weathered worse. But because Amara was no longer silent. And that meant the public couldn't be swayed, not by apologies, not by PR spins, not by flowers delivered in secrecy. She's weaponizing the media, he barked at Victor Malone. Victor didn't flinch. She's exercising her rights. There's a difference. Preston clenched his fists. This wasn't supposed to go this far. You hit your wife, Preston, Victor said coldly. That's what went too far. Meanwhile, inside Fiona's townhouse where Amara now stayed, the atmosphere was strangely calm. She drank ginger tea. She took slow walks in the garden. She attended every prenatal appointment, and she prepared, not for war but for peace. Her own. Still, the investigation moved fast. Detectives interviewed restaurant staff. Waiters recalled the scene vividly. Patrons submitted footage voluntarily, and security footage from La Belle Toll captured the moment in grainy black and white clarity, leaving no doubt. It wasn't long before Preston was called into a formal deposition. In the legal conference room, he sat stiffly between two attorneys. The DA's office representative sat across from him, expressionless. Mr. Whitmore, one began, you understand these questions pertain to a criminal investigation. Any falsehoods will be considered perjury. He nodded once, jaw tight. What was your relationship with your wife like leading up to the night of the incident? Preston hesitated. Tense. We argued. Was there ever physical violence before this? No, he said firmly. Did you strike her on the night of the incident? I lost my temper, he admitted. But it wasn't planned. It wasn't who I am. The DA leaned forward. You slapped a pregnant woman across the face in public. That's not an impulse, Mr. Whitmore. That's an act. The room went silent. The deposition ended with Preston rattled and cornered. As he stepped outside into the flashing lights of reporters, he realized something terrifying. He had underestimated her. Amara hadn't just exposed a moment. She had exposed a pattern, a mindset, a legacy of control he had wrapped in wealth and reputation, and now it was unraveling stitch by stitch. And yet, she hadn't spoken his name in anger once. That more than anything shook him. Preston Whitmore had never apologized for anything in his life. Not when he bulldozed a community garden to build high-rises. Not when he skipped out on investors' calls during a financial dip. Not when he missed anniversaries or walked out on staff mid-sentence. Apologies were for people who'd lost control, and Preston had always believed control was the only thing that kept powerful men from falling. But now he was falling, and fast. The formal deposition had shaken him more than he admitted. He had sat across from professionals who didn't flinch at his name, didn't soften their tone, didn't buy his charm. That terrified him more than any headline. So he did the thing he thought would fix it all. He sent an apology. First, a handwritten note. Amara, I made a mistake. I let pressure get to me. I hurt you, and I am deeply sorry. I want to make things right for you, for our child. Please, let's talk. Then came flowers. A bouquet of white orchids, her favorite. Then a call from his lawyer to Jasmine Lee's office, requesting a private meeting, just a conversation. He insisted. No lawyers. Just them. Closure. Amara read the note, then folded it and handed it to Jasmine. He's not sorry for hitting me, she said. He's sorry people saw it. Jasmine nodded, her voice quiet. You don't owe him a response. Amara didn't hesitate. Good. Because I'm done playing wife to a man who only sees me as a threat when I speak. The next day, the district attorney's office announced formal charges. 1 count of felony assault on a pregnant spouse. Preston's name was no longer just a trending topic, it was ink on a court docket. The news cycle roared again. Some said justice was finally arriving. Others wondered if it was too late. Talk shows debated whether a single slap, even on camera, should end a man's empire. But none of that mattered to Amara. She spent the day assembling a crib with Renee and talking to her therapist, Dr. Eleanor Bridges, about how to separate trauma from truth. I still dream about it, Amara confessed during a session. The noise, the look in his eyes, the way the room went silent, like everyone expected me to disappear. Bridges didn't interrupt. Amara kept going. And now that I didn't disappear, they don't know what to do with me. Doctor.
Bridges smiled gently. You did the unthinkable. You stood up.
And now the world is catching up to your courage. That evening, Preston met with his defense attorney in the shadowed privacy of his penthouse. We can push for a plea deal, Victor Malone said. Maybe community service, mandatory counseling, a public apology if you're willing to show remorse. Preston scoffed. Remorse? She humiliated me. Victor stood abruptly, tired of walking on eggshells. You humiliated yourself. You lost control in front of the world. If you want to salvage anything, your company, your future, you have to let go of the ego. Preston didn't respond. For the first time, even he wasn't sure what he was defending anymore. The next morning, Amara received a letter from the DA's office informing her that a trial date was likely. Her presence in court would be optional but encouraged. She read the letter in silence. Then she stood, walked to the window, and placed both hands over her belly. I'm ready, she whispered. And she meant it. Not because she wanted revenge, but because the child growing inside her deserved a world where silence wasn't survival, a world where truth had weight. A world where strength wasn't measured by what you endure, but by what you confront. It had been 137 days since the slap. Since the crystal lights above LaBelle Hall stopped shimmering, and every set of eyes turned toward a man striking his pregnant wife. Now, in a courtroom painted in beige and solemn silence, Amara Whitmore sat tall in a navy dress, her hands resting on her belly, her heart beating steady. This was the day the world would no longer remember her as just a video clip. This was the day she spoke. The courtroom was packed. Press lined the back. Women from Women First filled 2 full benches. Jasmine Lee sat at her side, steady as ever. Fiona, her lifelong friend, gripped her hand every time the double doors creaked open. And then he entered. Preston Whitmore. The man who once brought her roses, who had whispered baby names over morning coffee, now walked into the courtroom flanked by lawyers, dressed in a slate-grey suit that couldn't hide how gaunt he'd become. There was no applause, no aura, just the cold rustle of papers and a bailiff's voice echoing. Court is now in session. The Honourable Judge Eleanor Bridges presiding. The judge was a woman in her 60s with silver curls and sharp eyes. She didn't look at Preston. She didn't look at Amara. She looked at the entire room and said, "This is not theatre. This is not entertainment. This is justice." Opening statements followed. The prosecutor, Derek Monroe, laid it bare. This isn't about a man's legacy. It's about a woman's safety, a child's protection. What you saw in that video wasn't just a slap, it was power, used as a weapon. The defense, led by Victor Malone, tried to redirect. Mr. Whitmore has built homes, fed families, revitalized cities. What happened that night was a lapse. A single, regrettable moment under immense pressure. Amara didn't flinch, because moments she knew could shape destinies. The witnesses began. A waiter from Labelle Tall described the scene in clipped tones, still visibly shaken by what he had seen. A woman from a nearby table sobbed while describing the sound of Amara's gasp, how it still haunted her. And then came the unexpected. Lucia Moretti, a lounge singer from a high-end midtown hotel. Tall, elegant, and with a voice like smoke. She had once been Preston's secret. Now she was under oath. "We met at the Orchid Lounge," she said. "I was hired for Thursday nights. He started coming in after hours. At first, he was charming, generous. But over time, he changed. Short-tempered, possessive. Once, when I cancelled a dinner because of a fever, he slammed a wine glass on the bar in front of me. It shattered. There were murmurs. The judge silenced them. Lucia's hands trembled as she said, "I never reported it. But when I saw what happened to Amara, I couldn't stay quiet." Across the room, Preston's jaw clenched. Victor whispered urgently to him, "Don't react." But he already had. His composure cracked, even if only slightly, and in that moment, it was clear. Amara wasn't his only casualty. Just the one who stood up. Then came the part everyone had been waiting for. The bailiff called, "Mrs. Amara Whitmore to the stand." A hush fell. Amara rose. She moved slowly, not from fear, but from purpose. Her presence filled the courtroom, not because she raised her voice, but because she didn't have to. She placed her hand on the Bible, swore truth. Sat down. Derek Monroe stood. "Mrs. Whitmore, can you describe what happened on the night of the incident?" Amara took a breath, looked straight ahead. It was supposed to be a quiet evening. "I had called the office. They said he was working late, but then a message came through, a photo of him at a restaurant with someone else. I didn't go there to start a scene. I went because I was scared. I was carrying his child and I needed answers." Her voice never wavered. "I saw him laughing with her, like we didn't exist. And when I spoke, he didn't argue. He didn't deny it. He slapped me. Right there, in front of everyone." She paused. I fell back. Not from the force, from the shock. That was the man who once said he'd never raise his voice at me. And he didn't. They raised his hand instead. Some jurors were wiping tears. Others leaned forward. Then came Victor's cross-examination. He tried to corner her. "Tensions were high. You showed up unexpectedly. Could emotions have escalated?" Amara looked at him. Calm, clear. "Emotions don't excuse violence. Stress doesn't excuse harm. Nothing does. And you're sure this wasn't the only time tension arose in your marriage? Tension isn't the problem. Control is." Victor shifted. Amara held her ground. "This trial isn't about whether we had problems," she said, her voice rising for the first time. "This is about what a man did when he thought no one would hold him accountable." Silence followed. When she stepped down, she didn't look at Preston. She didn't need to. He had already seen her strength and knew it wasn't going anywhere. By the 7th day of the trial, the courtroom no longer felt like a place of it, felt like a battleground of truths. The prosecution had made their case. The slap, the bruises, the witnesses, the pattern of control. The defense had scrambled to reframe the narrative, a man under pressure, an empire on the brink, a moment of emotional collapse. But now, it was Preston Whitmore's turn to speak. The courtroom was packed again. Not just with press, but with strangers, people who didn't know Amara personally, but saw themselves in her story. Survivors, advocates, women in their 60s who had once stayed quiet, and daughters who vowed never to. Preston adjusted his tie and walked to the witness stand. For once, he looked like what he had never allowed himself to appear, small. He swore the oath, took his seat, and looked toward the jury, not Amara. His voice was measured, too measured. I'm not proud of what I did, but I want to make something clear. I didn't plan to hurt my wife. That night wasn't about anger, it was about fear. My company was failing. My legacy was collapsing. I wasn't thinking straight. He paused. I was raised by a single father who taught me to be tough, never cry, never admit weakness. I followed that, maybe too well. Victor Malone gave a slight nod from the defense table. I have spent my entire life building something. I never thought one mistake would bring it all down, but I own it. He finally turned to Amara, sitting still in the gallery, her hands folded in her lap. I'm sorry, he said. For everything. Not just that night, but every time I made you feel unseen. The courtroom was silent. It was convincing. Almost. Until the prosecutor stood up. Mr. Whitmore, Derek Monroe began, you say you own it, but you've spent most of this trial talking about your fear, your image, your company. Where in that list does your wife's pain land? Preston stiffened. That's not fair. Derek took a step forward. Is it fair that she had to relive her trauma in front of strangers? That she walks into grocery stores and sees her bruised face on tabloids? That your unborn child almost became collateral damage to your pride? A hush fell. Preston looked down. For once, he didn't have an answer. Later that afternoon, the judge allowed one final statement from Amara Whitmore, at her request, not required, not prompted, but permitted. The gallery sat breathless. Amara rose. She didn't take the witness stand this time. She stood at the front of the courtroom, hands lightly clasped over her belly, and looked each juror in the eye. I didn't come here to punish a man. I came here to protect a child. Her voice was low but steady. I've heard people say it was just a slap, that he didn't mean it, that stress explains everything. But I lived in that silence long before the slap. I lived in the cold dinners, the missed appointments. The way he looked through me like I was a shadow in his spotlight. She exhaled. I forgave him for being distant, for being cruel with words, for forgetting anniversaries. I told myself he was busy, overwhelmed, human. But when a man raises his hand to a woman who's carrying his child, that's not just human. That's dangerous. Some jurors shifted. One older woman dabbed her eyes. I didn't come here to destroy a legacy. I came here because one day, my child will ask me what kind of love they were born into. And I want to say, it began with courage, with truth. Her voice wavered only once. I am not bitter. I am not angry. I am healing. But healing begins with truth. And I need this courtroom to tell the truth. She stepped back, and the room sat still, weighted by something deeper than judgment. Respect. Even Preston, for all his ego and control, didn't look up. Judge Eleanor Bridges thanked her and dismissed the court for the day. That evening, the jury began deliberations. The morning the verdict came, the air outside the courthouse was cool and crisp, but inside, every breath felt heavy. Reporters lined the steps, microphones in hand. The courtroom was at capacity, no empty seats, no idle glances. Everyone sat forward, as if the floor itself might whisper the jury's decision before it was spoken. Amara Whitmore arrived just before 9 a.m., wearing a charcoal grey dress and a soft cream shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked like peace and gravity combined. Her hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and there was no makeup, only a quiet strength in her eyes that said, "I have already survived worse." Fiona walked beside her. Jasmine Lee followed close behind. Across the aisle, Preston Whitmore sat with his legal team. His once pristine image looked weathered. The tailored suit couldn't hide the bags under his eyes. His jaw was tight, his hands fidgeting, his lips pressed thin. No cameras were allowed inside, but if there had been, they would have captured a man unraveling at the seams. At exactly 9:15, the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise!" Judge Eleanor Bridges entered, her robe flowing like a final word, her face unreadable. The jury filed in next, 12 men and women, most of them older than Amara. Some had daughters of their own. Some had sons. One woman clutched a tissue. One man's hand trembled as he gripped the armrest of the jury box. The four-persona woman in her early 50s stood, holding the verdict form. Judge Bridges nodded. "Have you reached a unanimous verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." She handed the paper to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. A brief pause, then, "In the matter of the State versus Preston Whitmore, on the charge of felony assault against a pregnant spouse, how do you find the defendant?" The forewoman's voice was steady. "Guilty." A sharp inhale filled the room. Someone in the back gasped audibly. And for a beat, the courtroom froze in silence. Preston's shoulders dropped. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just lowered his head like a man who finally realized no amount of power could change the truth. Amara closed her eyes. Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her chin stayed high. She reached for Fiona's hand, then placed her other palm on her stomach, reassuring herself, and the child inside her, that it was over, that the storm had passed. Judge Bridges struck the gavel once. "Sentencing will take place in 2 weeks. Court is adjourned." The room stirred to life, but Amara didn't move. She waited. She breathed. She listened to the sound of justice echoing in her chest. Preston was escorted out a side door, not in handcuffs, but flanked by deputies. It didn't matter. The world had already seen what mattered most. He was no longer untouchable. Outside, the media swarmed, but Amara didn't stop for interviews. She didn't hold a press conference. She simply walked down the courthouse steps with Fiona and Jasmine by her side, past cameras, past flashes, past questions shouted in the wind. A few people clapped quietly. A woman whispered, "God bless you." Someone handed her a single sunflower, and for the first time in months, Amara smiled. It wasn't a victory grin. It was relief, and it was freedom. Later that night, she sat in Fiona's garden, wrapped in a knit blanket, sipping warm tea while the wind rustled the trees above. "I didn't expect to cry," she said softly. "You needed to," Fiona replied. "It wasn't weakness. It was release." Amara nodded. She ran a hand along the curve of her belly. "He'll grow up," she whispered, knowing his mother didn't back down. Fiona smiled. "And he'll be proud." The news played softly on the TV in the background. Preston Whitmore found guilty. Legal analysts say it marks a turning point for high-profile domestic violence cases. Advocates hope it empowers more women to come forward. But Amara had stopped listening. She didn't need the headlines. She had lived the story. She had rewritten the ending. And as the stars came out above her, she finally let go of the weight she'd carried alone. She wasn't just a woman who had been struck. She was a woman who stood back up and kept walking. The news broke like thunder. Preston Whitmore, guilty. Within hours, the headlines swarmed every major outlet. Talk shows dedicated full segments. Podcasts analyzed the courtroom footage. Newspapers ran dual profile zone of Preston, the fallen tycoon, and one of Amara, the resilient mother-to-be. But in the quiet corners of the world, where TV screens flickered in kitchens and nursing homes, where women sat beside husbands or granddaughters with tearful eyes, there was only one name people whispered with admiration: Amara Whitmore. She had become a symbol, not because she asked to be, but because she stood when others had folded. Because she told the truth and didn't flinch when it echoed louder than anyone expected. Across town, Serafina Moretti sat in her dimly lit condo, phone buzzing endlessly. Some messages were cruel, others oddly sympathetic. But the one she couldn't stop rereading was the anonymous email forwarded to her by her agent. "You were complicit. You may not have hit her, but you helped the man who did. Own that. Do something right for once." For once, Serafina felt the weight of the stage she had climbed on. She had told herself she was just the mistress, the muse, the misunderstood woman in silk dresses and shadowy lounges. But now she realized she'd stood too close to a fire she could have helped smother. So she did something no one expected. She released a public statement. No PR firm, no lawyer edits, just her voice. To Amara Whitmore, and to every woman who's ever been dismissed, ignored, or silenced, I'm sorry. I was part of a story that hurt you. I told myself it wasn't my problem, that I wasn't responsible for his actions. But silence is a choice, and I chose wrong. I hope someday you find peace beyond this pain, and I hope I can become better than the woman I was in that restaurant. The post went viral. Some praised her. Others accused her of damage control, but Amara didn't respond. She didn't need to. She had already closed that chapter the moment she walked out of the courthouse with her head held high. Instead, Amara focused on her next journey: motherhood. She moved out of Fiona's home and into a small, sunlit rental tucked behind a community garden. Modest, warm, hers. She set up a nursery with soft blues and yellows, choosing names that reminded her of strength: Isaiah, Grace, Elijah. She began journaling daily again, not about Preston, not about court, but about healing, motherhood, and hope. Jasmine Lee encouraged her to speak at a Women First event. At first, Amara declined. "I'm not ready to be anyone's inspiration," she said. But a month later, she changed her mind. She stood on a simple stage in a community center gymnasium, the walls lined with folding chairs and faces of every color and age. And she told her story. Not with drama, not with vengeance, with clarity. With grace. Afterward, a woman in her 70s approached her, eyes brimming. "I stayed silent for 40 years, she said, voice shaking. "But you gave me permission to speak." Amara hugged her, and something inside her finally released. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was leading. She began collaborating with advocacy groups, hosting listening circles, supporting legal aid funds, organizing baby showers for survivors rebuilding their lives. The woman who had once curated her identity to fit into Preston's world had become a force entirely her own. Meanwhile, Preston faced his own reckoning. Though sentencing hadn't occurred yet, his business empire crumbled daily. Sponsors pulled out. Board members resigned. His once loyal staff sent out resumes. The foundation he built on intimidation and image now stood like a mansion with cracked beams and no doors. He watched Amara's Women First speech online from a hotel room no longer bearing his name. For the first time, he saw her not as the woman who'd ruined him, but the woman he'd underestimated. The woman who'd outgrown him. Who no longer needed his name or his apology. Spring came quietly that year. The cherry blossoms outside Amara's window bloomed early, their petals floating like whispers through the open glass. A new season, a new name on the mailbox. A new rhythm in her chest. She was no longer counting weeks of pregnancy. She was counting breaths. Her labor came just before dawn, gentle at first, then demanding in a way only nature understands. Fiona drove her to the hospital, her hands steady on the wheel, her voice calm. Jasmine Lee arrived soon after, followed by a nurse from the Women First Network who stayed beside Amara throughout every contraction. Hours later, with soft sweat on her brow and tears of disbelief in her eyes, Amara Whitmore delivered a healthy baby boy. His cry wasn't sharp, it was strong. As if he knew, even from his first breath, that he had been born into a legacy of courage. She named him Elias Raymond Whitmore. Elias for Yahweh is my strength. Raymond for her father, who taught her that gentleness and protection were not opposites. She cradled him to her chest and whispered the vow she'd made silently in that courtroom months earlier. You will never know fear in your home. You will never see your mother flinch. You will grow up knowing what love sounds like and what it doesn't. 2 weeks later, Preston Whitmore stood before the judge once again. No designer tie, no entourage, just a muted suit, dark circles under his eyes, and a sentence hanging over his head. His lawyers had pleaded for leniency, community service, therapy, house arrest. Judge Eleanor Bridges wasn't swayed. Mr. Whitmore, she said, her voice clear, you were not a desperate man. You were a powerful one. And you used that power not to protect, but to harm. That's not a lapse, that's a choice. She sentenced him to 5 years, 2 to serve. 3 suspended, with mandatory counseling, loss of corporate voting rights, and permanent community monitoring. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no gasps. Just a quiet understanding that something real had been done. Preston didn't cry. But as he was led out in handcuffs for the first time, he didn't look for the cameras. He didn't look for Amara either, because he knew this wasn't her ending. It was his. 3 months later, Amara stood behind a podium at the National Domestic Justice Summit, holding Elias against her shoulder. She hadn't planned to bring him on stage, but he fussed backstage, and the moment demanded truth, not polish. She wore a simple blue dress. No headlines announced her presence, no spotlight. Just her voice. I used to think healing was a place, she began. A quiet house. A safe job, a new relationship. But I've learned healing is not a place, it's a direction. It's a decision you make every day to choose yourself over silence. She adjusted Elias on her hip. I chose to leave. I chose to speak. I chose to protect my son, and I chose to believe that my story or story could help someone else find the strength to do the same. The crowd stood, applauding not just the words but the woman who spoke them. The woman who once wept behind closed doors. The woman who now stood with a child in her arms and fire in her voice. In the months that followed, Amara launched a non-profit called The Safe Room. It wasn't flashy, just a network of shelters, advocacy clinics, and free legal aid for women who needed more than a hotline, they needed a home. She partnered with Jasmine Lee, with Fiona, even Sarafina Moretti, who volunteered anonymously, sorting supplies in the back room once a week, never asking for credit, just showing up. Amara never stopped writing either. Her memoir, After the Slap, became a quiet bestseller among older women's book clubs and Sunday church reading groups. Not because it was scandalous, but because it told the truth with grace. And on Elias's first birthday, Amara didn't throw a grand party. She invited a dozen women from her first support circle. They brought their babies, their scars, their stories. They sat in her backyard under string lights, passing around plates of peach cobbler and holding each other's children like kin. At one point, Fiona raised a glass. To Amara, she said, for turning pain into purpose. And to Elias for being born into the arms of a woman who remembered who she was. They clinked glasses. Elias giggled in his mother's arms, and Amara smiled wide, whole, and free. Because healing wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning. In life, it's easy to stay quiet, to preserve peace, protect image, or avoid the storm. But silence can become a prison, especially when it hides pain. Amara's journey reminds us that strength isn't about appearing unshaken, it's about choosing truth over comfort, even when your voice trembles. For many older adults, especially women, the idea of enduring was once praised. But endurance without boundaries is not virtue, it's self-erasure. This story gently urges us to reconsider what love, dignity, and healing look like in the later chapters of life. You're never too old to walk away from what breaks you. You're never too far gone to start again with grace. And you're never alone in reclaiming your worth. Whether it's leaving a toxic relationship, standing up for someone else, or finally saying, "I deserve more," remember this: your story isn't over until you decide it is. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't to fight, but to rise quietly and walk toward peace.